It is no surprise that Sega was always looking to best Nintendo at everything they did with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The riveting saga of Sega and Nintendo's rivalry during the 1980s and mid-1990s is one of the earliest and most notable console wars in the history of video gaming. After the US market was flooded with subpar games, the industry was in a definite slump. But on the other side of the world, both Nintendo and newcomer Sega were experiencing success in Japan. As Sega tried to dethrone Nintendo, both companies realised that they needed to expand into the American market. While Nintendo dismissed Sega as a credible competitor for many years, it wouldn't be long before the mounting tension shifted their entire focus to a singular goal: to merge as the victor in the high-stakes console war. And on this note, Sega certainly took note that Capcom's arcade beat-em-up Final Fight was a huge success in the arcades, where it competed with other Sega beat-em-ups such as Golden Axe. Capcom announced that the home port of Final Fight would be exclusive to the SNES. This led Sega's internal staff to plan their own beat-em-up in the same vein as Final Fight. That game was Streets of Rage, or Bare Knuckle as it was titled in Japan. An incredible and gritty side-scrolling beat-em-up with arcade elements that would easily compete with that of Final Fight. The story was quite simple. It centres on the efforts of several ex-police vigilantes trying to rid the fictional American metropolis of Wood Oak City of a crime syndicate that has corrupted its local government. Now, Streets of Rage was well received, and there were 3 games on the series that were developed and released by Sega for the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis as you'd like to call it in America. The games were also particularly recognised for the brilliant electronic dance music soundtracks, scored primarily by Yuzo Koshiro and Motohiro Kawashima, and they've also received much praise for their music. I loved the music, it was brilliant. And surprisingly, Streets of Rage were largely overlooked by Sega in recent years. However, Streets of Rage had finally received a much needed sequel in 2020 by an entirely new team. Streets of Rage 4 is a true sequel through and through. For me, all of these games are simply legendary. So in this retrospective video review, I'm going to go back and rediscover these classic games, not just only on the Sega Genesis, but also on the other ports released on the other platforms. So without further delay, I present to you the Streets of Rage series, The Complete History. Now, for Sega to develop a Final Fight beater with Streets of Rage, they needed a talented crack team to pull this off. So, Sega's Norioshi Ohba was selected as the director of the new upcoming game during the early 1990s. Ohba was still considered a fresh graduate from Waseda University 3 years prior to him starting work on Streets of Rage. The crazy thing is, Ohba studied economics and business, yet ended up working and advancing rapidly at Sega. He started working at Sega as a planner on early games like Wonder Boy and Monsterland, then eventually ended up as a game director for the massively popular The Revenge of the Shinobi, or also known as Super Shinobi, on the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. After he redefined the Shinobi franchise with The Revenge of Shinobi, Ohba took on the task of creating a competitor to Capcom's Final Fight arcade game. Sega also had team members that just finished up in the 1990s eSWAT, City Under Siege, to join Ohba in the creation of this new Final Fight competitor. One of those standout developers was Hiroki Chino, who served as a game designer for both eSWAT and the first Streets of Rage game, and he later done Sonic CD 2. Atsushi Siyamiya would also join the team as an art designer, having worked also previously on the eSWAT game, but also on Capcom's Strider, which was also released on the Genesis and Mega Drive as well. So, Streets of Rage, or Bare Knuckles, started development under the working title of D-SWAT, where the D stood for Dragon. What a name if you think about it. The Dragon SWAT, that's as 90s as a name can get. Anyway, development started on July the 16th, 1990, with the team hoping to finish up the game by December the 31st of the same year. That would mean that just under 10 developers working for 6 months would create the first entry to this legendary franchise. Wow, gaming sure has changed in the past 25 years, huh? Now, I have to say I never really liked the name eSWAT, and having following a game like D-SWAT would just sound silly. So I'm glad to say that the team changed the name of the game. Now, while I grew up calling the franchise Streets of Rage, there was something about that title Bare Knuckle. It sounds so badass. But I can see why it got a name change. But it wasn't just the name that changed when D-SWAT became Bare Knuckle or Streets of Rage. All three of the main characters did too. In early drafts, the lead character for the game was called God Hand, a white male character that seemed to be inspired by America's Chuck Norris. God Hand, or Mr. Hand as we call him, got his name changed to Hawk in beta and then finally became the Axel Stone that we all know today. The early versions of the game also had Blackbird, which was unfortunately their early suggestion name for what became Adam Hunter. Flippin' heck, what a name. Of course, before he became Adam Hunter, he was also known as Wolf, which is still a better name than Blackbird. And then lastly, there was Blaze, which got her name as Pink Pythoon. Flippin' heck, that's something like a porn movie, is it? I would certainly say that the final looks are way better than what was originally planned. And when the team finally released Streets of Rage to the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive, gosh, it was a smashing success, and ended up becoming a bigger brand name than Final Fight. Well, at least on the home consoles, that is. Okay, while the basic mechanics of Streets of Rage borrow heavily from Final Fight, the team did try to expand on the gameplay by adding more abilities when it came to grapples, and even featured counter-grapple moves for each character. This made you actually want to learn the mechanics and get the upper hand. Sure, it wasn't deep, but it was better than nothing. Right, so what's the story of the first Streets of Rage on the Genesis? Well, the city was once a happy, peaceful place, until one day, a powerful secret criminal organisation took over. This vicious syndicate soon had control of the government, and even the police force. The city has become a centre of violence where no one is safe. Amid this turmoil, a group of young police officers has sworn to clean up the city. Among them are Adam Hunter, Axel Stone and Blaze Fielden. They are willing to risk anything, even their lives, on the Streets of Rage. Players act as Adam, Axel or Blaze, who saved Wood Oak City from being overtaken by a criminal syndicate led by Mr. X. The three characters play differently with their own strengths and weaknesses. Adam Hunter is strong and has an incredible jump kick, but walks slower than the other two. I tended to play with them on higher difficulty settings. Then there's Blaze, she is the fastest with a pretty good jump. However, she is the weakest of the three. I would say she is perhaps more suited for lower difficulty settings. Now, Axel is my favourite character. Okay, his jump kick is not as good as the other two, but he is quick and he is strong. So, once you've selected your character, it's time to play the game. At its core, you have one job to do. Walk right and beat the stew out of anyone who comes on the screen. You are confronted by a gang of different types of thugs and no-gooders. These bad guys will often come in different colour schemes, signifying a tougher version to fight. They will also come at you several at a time, from different angles and with different attacks. This works out just fine for you though, as you can knock down entire groups with a well-placed kick, or even better, throw some unfortunate soul into a group of his buddies. Now, every enemy has a name and a health bar that appears when they're on the screen. This is nice, as you can see who takes more hits, who's about to die, and what you should write on their tombstone. To accomplish your mission, you have a nice variety of moves. Each of the three characters can punch, kick, jump, flip, grab and throw villains all over the screen. In addition, you will come across weapons like baseball bats, large pipes, knives and even a trusty broken bottle to smash some faces with. And when all else fails, each player has a special button. Pressing this will call on a police car, driving a nice and 300ZX no less, with an officer hanging out the window with a rocket launcher. Flippin' heck. And they fire into the air and the resulting explosion will clear all but the toughest enemies in one hit. I have to say, I'm not too sure how a police car could shoot a missile at a 45-degree angle and somehow hit an elevator on the building above, damaging everyone but the player character, but I don't think it really matters. Each player also has a health bar that goes down with each hit. You can refill health with food that you can find lying around in the street. Yeah, that's right, eating off the dirty street. Anyway, an apple on the street will replenish some of your energy, while beef will recover your health completely. Other items like phone booths or barrels might also reveal some food or weapons when destroyed. There's also items such as money bags that give you 1000 points and gold bars that give you an incredible 5000 points. Why is this important? Well, you get an extra life after every 50,000 points, so collecting these items are quite important. Now, with regards to the levels, there are 8 of them to fight through. The first level is a classic Sega stage that you will always remember. The level starts in the dangerous streets. It's quite a straightforward level, which introduces you to the common enemies and items. At the end of all levels, you will confront a boss. These guys are larger and much tougher than the common hired hands. Often they have special moves and weapons that you will have to learn to be able to finish them off effectively. Now, the first level boss is Antonio, and he is quite easy to finish. And once you've beaten a boss, they will often appear as regular fighters later on in the game. Stage 2, it continues our journey through the streets. Now, I have to say, with regards to the controls, Streets of Rage gets a whole lot done with just 3 buttons. By default, the A button is the special attack button, and as I said, pressing it will call in the airstrike. The B button is your attack button, and the C button is your jump. You will do different attacks based on where you are and what you are doing. If you are just walking up to a bad guy, you will punch him right in the face. Keep hitting the attack button and you will follow up with a couple of punches with a combo that will knock them down. One punch to the face will daze the opponent, and you can then move towards them and initiate a grab. From here you can, depending on which character you have, knee them in the groin a couple of times and then headbutt them. Or push a direction on the D button and press attack to throw them into a group of other bad guys. If someone's trying to sneak up behind you, pressing B and C will do a quick little backwards attack. Combining all these together makes for a very satisfying beatdown, while only needing a couple of buttons to master. Plus, if your fist gets too bloody, you can just pick up a baseball bat and start cracking skulls with it. Great fun. However, one thing to note is that you can also hit your fellow player. I certainly remember playing this 2-player with my dad, and it can get a little frustrating sometimes when your dad tosses a bad guy across the screen only to hit and knock you down with the rest of the street scum. And I do recall, more times than I can recall, I accidentally punched my dad's face, which resulted in him popping me back in the mouth before we both agreed to get back up and fight the real bad guys. I have to say, I did find it rather amusing to get caught up in the fighting and then have to calm things down with your partner. But hey, these are the main streets and it gets real sometimes. Now, while you can hit and punch each other, you can also use this to your advantage. I mean, if you grab a buddy from behind, he or she can use you as leverage to kick some dude in the face and then sling you over the shoulder into another group. It certainly takes a while to get good at all these possible mechanics, but when you do, you become a force to be reckoned with. The boss in this one is a bit tricky. Let's have a look. Stage 3 changes the scenery and is now set along the beautiful beach. Now the boss looks like an ultimate wrestling warrior that keeps running at you. He looks tricky, but is relatively easy to finish off with timely jump kicks. Stage 4 takes place on a bridge. Now, these levels have holes that you need to avoid as they will give instant death if you fall into them, so be careful. However, I have to say it was enjoyable throwing the bad guys into them also. I liked this level, it had good visuals and I liked those water effects also. Now the boss here is called Banjo. He attacks by running at you while breathing fire. Not sure what this fella's been eating. He's a slightly tricky bastard, this one, as you need to avoid him and get behind him for you to attack him or get a few combos in. However, don't try throw him as he's far too heavy and will crush you. Now, I have to say, this level does have nice scrolling graphics, and there does seem to be more enemies on screens at a time, and you also face a mini-boss, who you will remember as the main boss from Stage 3. Let's check it out. Now, the end boss in this level is tricky, and there are two of them. Bloody hell, two of them. They are basically two versions of Blade-Off, for Christ's sake. They are tricky to say the least. Now, I have to say, I found this a bloody tricky level. Jump kicks seem ineffective most of the time, and grabbing them to throw them ends up backfiring, where they end up throwing me instead. Very tricky. Okay, now we're on stage 6, which is situated in a factory, and it introduces conveyor belts and crushers, which if not careful, you will get crushed. You need to keep an eye on that red light that indicates it coming down. Although I have to say, I did enjoy crushing the bad guys. On flipping heck, there's also a repeat fight, that fire-breathing Bongo, and then there's another two bosses to fight at the end. I found this boss fight the hardest and least fun. Right, stage 7. Now thankfully this is more fun, where you're basically on an elevator that is moving up the building. When the elevator stops, then you will need to fight hordes of bad guys. Again, I liked throwing them over the edge, I have to say, great fun. I'm also pleased to say that there are no bosses in this level, definitely one of my better levels. Alright, now we're on to stage 8, and this is the final level. Now, in this level you walk from right to left. Strange, huh? Now, it is important to point out that there are no backup cops in this level. You can't call your backup cops with those bazookas. Nope. And Jesus, this is a tricky level that is certainly the longest level with the most bad guys, and not to mention that it also has all the bosses from all the levels to contend with here. Christ, even the bloody tables attack you. So having no backup is going to be a challenge. Oh, and I forgot to say that there is a time limit on this level too. Gee, thanks. And again, the most frustrating fight was those two bitches that looked like Blade. Man, I certainly lost most of my lives there. You really need to be patient with this level. Now, eventually, you will get to that Mr. X. Now, be careful, as Mr. X will give you a choice to join his syndicate. And if you say yes, of which I did at first, then that bastard will send you back to stage 6. Stage 6, as I said, don't say yes. Anyway, fight his goons, and then Mr. X has a machine gun and will charge at you. But you will beat him, and then you have finally beaten Streets of Rage. Thank God. Streets of Rage featured an ending, with her features triumphing over Mr. X and his syndicate, giving the player a sense of accomplishment. The good ending featured our hero standing over the slumped body of Mr. X as it slowly fades into a brown monochrome photograph. The scene after has the two exit the syndicate building with a rocket launching friend waiting for them outside. After this, our heroes get dropped off at the beach as the gang watches the sun set into the night time, with the waves splashing. We finally get the end text appear on the screen also. This is the ending that most people remember from the game, and it is a nice little happy way to end the adventure. However, but unlike most beat 'em ups, in this time the game also featured a series of bad endings that are basically the same, just different character models depending on who you beat the game with. I suppose these bad endings are cool Easter eggs really. So what's my verdict of this game? Well, Streets of Rage is an easy game to pick up and start playing right away. It's not a difficult game. The standard bad guys shouldn't cause you many problems, but when they do gang up, they do give a little challenge. The bosses get a little harder, but you do have patterns that you can figure out and exploit. The levels rank up in difficulty at a pretty good pace, and the game feels very balanced. You'll most likely have to go at it a few times to win though. In regards to the graphics and the art style in Streets of Rage, well, it's fantastic. The characters and enemies are all well designed and colourful with some great animation. Let your character sit still for a second and they will have some cool little idle animations as they wait for the next fight. Cool touch. The backgrounds on each level are varied and unique. There are cool effects on each level from multiple scrolling layers to add depth, detailed city skylines, lapping waves on the beach and much more. And then there are the tiny details everywhere. Trash blowing in the street, neon signs, torn posters on the walls and other small but very detailed graphics that showcase the work that went into this game. No two levels look the same. Now, while the game's setting and gameplay could be compared to Final Fight, one place that the game soared over the competition was this soundtrack by now legendary video game composer Yuzo Koshiro. Yuzo Koshiro took techno and club music and pumped it beautifully through the Sega Genesis Mega Drive hardware to produce some of the most mind-melting 16-bit home music ever created. Yuzo Koshiro certainly set the bar very high. One of the things about the early days of Sega was the creative freedom that the workers had there, and as a result delivered great products. While the team worked from Japan, they aimed the music at American and European audiences. I think this is one of the reasons the soundtrack resonated so well with gamers outside of Japan. From the very beginning intro music to the kick in level 1, beginning all the way to the final boss fight, you may never hear the Sega Genesis crank out any better tunes outside of the Sonic series. The music for Streets of Rage is nothing short of legendary. And it's not just the music, the standard sound effects are no slouch either. Punches, kicks and screams are all great, and when combined with the music makes this game an absolute joy to listen to. So, in summary, Streets of Rage is a top tier game that anyone with a Sega Genesis should own. It's an absolute blast to play, and while you can play all day and have a great time by yourself, getting a buddy to play with you and joining in the two players is where it's at. I have thoroughly enjoyed playing back through this game. It was absolutely brilliant. Now, Streets of Rage was also around in the arcades too. The 1991 release was part of Sega's Mega Play cabinet. Mega Play was an Asian and European arcade cabinet that loaded Mega Drive games with specific modification to the game's engines to suit the arcade. Typically just more information displayed on screen, and you would play them based on a time limit. Now, the West did receive a version of this cabinet, but it was called the Sega Megatech, and it did include more games, including some Master System titles. However, games such as Streets of Rage were not included with this one. Now, Streets of Rage was also released on the Game Gear in 1992 and also on the Master System in 1993. So let's have a look, starting with the Game Gear version. Now, the Game Gear never got much in the way of beat 'em ups, which is a bummer for me, since it's easily one of my favourite genres of classic gaming. I didn't know what to expect from Streets of Rage, but I decided to give it a try anyway. Obviously, my first impressions were not really good. This version of Streets of Rage is forgotten for a reason. It's far from the worst Game Gear or anything like that. Heck, it even copies the Genesis original pretty closely, but it is a stripped down and flawed version of the series start. When you first start the game up, you will instantly be familiar with the title screen and story from the Genesis version. Now, you can only pick from Axel and Blaze this time around, as Adam is missing from the game. The game also only has 5 of the 8 stages present in the original, and each of the stages present here replicates its console sibling almost perfectly, just with more limited graphics and audio. Again, not a bad thing, and the programmers deserve due credit for this area of the game. The graphics have a ton of detail here, and almost all of the objects and backgrounds made it over. I suppose only having 5 stages present left the programmers plenty of cartridge space to make the graphics shine. And with regards to the music, it does sound very 8-bit like, as it should, but each of the tunes are instantly recognisable and very memorable here too. Yuzo Koshiro really shines, even here with the lesser horsepower of the Game Gear. However, unfortunately, the gameplay doesn't fare as well here. The game was very difficult to play through, as the collision detection is really shoddy. Axel is just a tad too slow and is overpowered by the enemy's speed too easily. Blaze is fast enough to keep up, but is too weak and is overpowered by the enemy's strength. Your basic punch-kick combos don't always connect with the enemies properly, and often some or the entire combo will miss, allowing the enemies a chance to counteract too easily and giving them the chance to gang up on you. And on top of that, the special attacks are missing, causing you to have to rely on mainly jump kicks and throws. For me, it's just too sloppy to play right, and it gets too frustrating to be any fun for more than a stage or two. I mean, I have to admit, once I turned it off, I never really had any intention of playing it again. So, Streets of Rage on the Game Gear is a game with a lot of potential and some big shoes to fill, but it doesn't quite live up to it. It's not a horrible game, but it could have been much better if Sega had just spent some more time tweaking and polishing the gameplay. So, as it stands, it's really not recommended unless you're just a die-hard obsessed with all things Streets of Rage or Game Gear. Now for the Streets of Rage on the Master System. As far as conversions go, I don't think anybody could have seen this coming. Have a few beers, and then maybe a few more, squint your eyes a bit, and you just might as well be looking at the Mega Drive version. Unlike the Game Gear, all 3 characters are there. In fact, the introduction all the way to the character select screen is almost identical to its 16-bit brother. The Master System has yearned for a good beat 'em up, and this is it. The sprites are well defined and animated, and the game runs at the same speed as the Mega Drive, with almost as good collision detection. Punches and kicks find quite a satisfying sweet spot. Unlike the Game Gear version, I literally couldn't put this game down. Previous Master System games have threatened to bridge the gap to the 16-bit, but this almost achieves it. And with regards to the bosses, well, do you know what, they're just as menacing and are all ported in. This version even has an extra boss on round 6. It's all good to be true, isn't it? Well, after the initial wonderment, certain aspects of Streets of Rage expose the flaws of the 8-bit. First of all, the sound is passable at best, as none of the tracks have come across well. The music has certainly been cut down here. Sound effects have certainly been done better on the Master System, and the game suffers from an awful bleeping sound every time that go sign flashes, or when your character picks something up. I certainly feel that the sound was rushed, whereas everything else in the game was actually very good. Another sacrifice is the excellent 2-player mode, but the game is more than enough solo, I suppose. Another observation I noted while playing the game was that only 2 enemy characters can appear on the screen at once. However, that's to be expected from an 8-bit game, and I have to say, it was only a minor point, because the game, it does play well. And how does the difficulty of this version compare to the Mega Drive? Well, the original suffered from being a little bit too easy, but this Master System version is definitely tougher to beat. And unlike the Game Gear, the police backup is actually included in this game, but having to reach over to your power base to pause the game to do it can be very annoying, especially when you're swamped with baddies all armed with blooming knives. But all in all, in summary, Streets of Rage on the Master System is a fantastic achievement, and it's certainly the best fighting game you're going to play on the system. Let's have a look. Now, interestingly, Streets of Rage was also available for the iPhone and iPad, and I have to say it was a pretty good game actually. Well, certainly for a mobile game that is. And in this version of the game, it featured 3 playable characters, 8 rounds of fast-paced brawling action, local Wi-Fi multiplayer support to help you beat those bosses, and not to mention that devastating rocket-propelled special attack from the eSWAT team. Unfortunately, the 2-player feature was unavailable, but that is to be expected on an iPhone, I suppose. Other features included save your games, save your progress at any point in the game, I like that. And there was also leaderboards to compete with the world for the high scores. A pretty decent mobile conversion of Streets of Rage, I have to say. Let's have a look. Now, there certainly has been a number of various re-releases of Streets of Rage via various Sega game compilations. So let's have a look at some of those, starting with that Sega Classic Arcade Collection, which was released for the Sega Mega CD. So, Sega Classics Arcade Collection is a compilation of 4 or 5 Sega Mega Drive games for the Mega CD. It was a pack-in game bundled with the launch Mega CDs in the United Kingdom and North America, and was released separately in other regions. Now, there are 2 variants of the Sega Classics Arcade Collection which exist, an earlier version seen in North America and Japan, which contains Golden Axe, Streets of Rage, Columns and The Revenge of Shinobi, and a later version seen in Europe and later North America bundles, which throws in Super Monaco GP. In North America, the older 4-in-1 variant came in the same box as Sherlock Holmes, Consultant Detective Volume 1, which was later 5-in-1, which came with Echo the Dolphin. And Streets of Rage is generally the same as the Genesis version, aside from the voices, which are CD quality enhanced. Now, despite the fact that Streets of Rage was designed to compete with the Nintendo SNES Final Fight, it was eventually released on the Nintendo Wii, provided through Nintendo's Virtual Console service. And then in 2013, Streets of Rage was also released as an addition to the growing selection of Sega's 3D retro classics on the Nintendo 3DS. The transition from 2D to 3D has been a subtle one for Streets of Rage. There's not a great deal of parallax to be seen in the first few levels, although this does change as you progress through the game. The result is a game which doesn't use the 3DS console's auto-stereoscopic display quite as effectively as its staplemates 3D Sonic the Hedgehog and 3D Shinobi 3 Return of the Ninja Master, but the effect is always there, always noticeable and always welcome. Developer M2 has performed its usual magic when it comes to additional options. You can play either as the international or Japanese version of the game. It goes by the name as Bare Knuckles, you know, in its homeland, and it remaps all the buttons to suit your own personal taste. The biggest bonus is the introduction of the one-hit kill mode by the name Fists of Death. Here, enemies can be dispatched by a single blow, making it feel like you're playing an episode of Fist of North Star. It's an amusing distraction from the main game, but not a feature you're likely to use more than once. As a 3D classic, Streets of Rage doesn't offer as many embellishments as some of M2's other efforts, but this matters little when the game is of such a high standard. Do you know what makes a great sequel? The answer? Everything the Streets of Rage 2 does, as this game takes what made the original game work so well and then throws them on the steroids. They were lucky though, since sometimes the use of steroids can result in some shrinkage. But there is nothing small with this sequel, since everything has bigger, better, bolder, bulging muscles, and just gets everything so right when it could have easily gone so wrong.
Where do we start?
How about his knee?
That's his face. If that's his face, what's this?
So, Streets of Rage 2, known as Bare Knuckle 2 in Japan, was developed and published by Sega in 1992 for the Genesis and Mega Drive. This game was developed by an ad hoc team of several companies: Sega, Ancient, Shout, Designworks, M&M Software and HIC. The development was really led by Ancient, with the company co-founded by Yuzo Koshiro, with his younger sister Ayano, and their mother. Ayano Koshiro was the lead graphic designer and one of the game designer planners, while her brother Yuzo Koshiro composed the music. This brother-sister team took inspiration from Capcom's Street Fighter 2, an arcade cabinet of which they had installed at the Ancient office. And the game was really programmed by the same team as the original Streets of Rage. Ancient looked to expand upon and improve the original in every way. For me, Streets of Rage 2 is quite possibly the best sequel of all time, and one of the best games ever released. It's certainly got bigger and higher quality sprites than before, and a larger moveset in a more vibrant and detailed environment also. Such a great game. And you know, incredibly, this immensely improved sequel was released in little under a year and a half after its predecessor. So anyway, let's have a look at the game. So what's the story here then? Well, 1 year has passed since ex-police officers Adam Hunter, Axel Stone and Blaze Fielding broke the Syndicate's hold and destroyed its leader, the mysterious Mr. X. Peace is returned and the three heroes come together to celebrate the anniversary of the events. While Axel and Blaze moved out of the city, Adam still lives there, together with his kid brother Eddie Skate Hunter. The morning after the party, Eddie finds the house a total ruin and Adam kidnapped. And all of this marks the beginning of the return of the gangs, even worse than before. For crying out loud. And on top of that, the guys at the police force who provided backup last year are no longer available. However, Adam's brother Skater and Axel's friend Max join forces with Blazer and Axel to once again defeat Mr. X. So the characters in the sequel are Alex Stone and Blaze Fielding who return, while the game also introduces the two new characters, Adam's kid brother Sammy, skating the West, highlighting his rollerblades, and Max, a slow-moving but powerful wrestler. And as we can see, Adam also fell by the wayside because he's being kidnapped, so he's not a playable character. I mean, these two new characters are at opposite ends of the spectrum to the more balanced Blaze and Axel. I have to say, I like these two new characters, but I have to say, I wish Adam was in the game, perhaps as an unlockable, but unfortunately he isn't. So like the previous game, Streets of Rage 2 is a side-scrolling beat-em-up in which 1 or 2 players fight against waves of enemies while picking up weapons and items along the way. In addition to standard attacks which have been expanded from the previous game, each character can perform a unique blitz attack by double tapping a direction before attacking. Now the special attacks deal extra damage or attack enemies from all directions, but it's at the cost of the player's health. I have to say I kinda missed that police car attack that was in the previous game, but hey ho. Now one thing is definitely worth mentioning is that Yuzo Koshiro's soundtrack really did push the envelope, expanding on the house and techno foundation of the original and fusing infectious melodies with an ever expanding list of genre influences from funk to ambient, jazz to hip hop, all underscored by a driving beat that seemed to reflect and enhance the gameplay in a very potent way. This soundtrack, a precursor to the electronica of the PlayStation generation, is still held as some of the best video game music ever created. The game, it's just free-flowing fun with a pumping soundtrack to punctuate the experience. The game is pretty much perfection. So let's continue by looking at the other levels. Well, there you go, wasn't that brilliant? Now, upon release, Streets of Rage 2 received critical acclaim and topped sales charts for months. The game is commonly regarded as the best entry in the series, the best beat-em-up game for the Sega Genesis, one of the best beat-em-up and Sega Genesis games in general, and is considered one of the greatest video games of all time. Its soundtrack too has also been considered one of the greatest of all time. Streets of Rage 2 was a massive hit. The console wars were raging, and in the context of the schoolyard, it was up there with the sheer speed and fun of the Sonic games and the uncensored version of Mortal Kombat as one of the biggest and final feathers in the Genesis cool cap. Sega fanboys would arguably never have better ammunition to prove that Sega truly did what Nintendo don't. Now, similar to the first Streets of Rage, an arcade version of Streets of Rage 2 was released onto Sega's Mega Drive based Mega Play hardware. It uses a regular credit system, and in this version all 1-ups have been replaced by money bags. There is no in-game timer, and the difficulty levels are one step above the Mega Drive version. Scoring is kept by a number of knockouts instead of damage inflicted. Now, the Master System and Game Gear 8-bit versions of Streets of Rage 2 are quite different from the Mega Drive original, and to each other, similar to the Master System and Game Gear version of Sonic the Hedgehog. In addition to having different levels and inferior graphics, Max Thunder is omitted from both these versions. So let's start by looking at Streets of Rage 2 for the Game Gear, which hit stores shelves in 1993. Streets of Rage 2 does a pretty good job of bringing the thrills of the classic Genesis franchise onto the Game Gear. As you would expect, the controls are simple and take no time to get accustomed to. Move your character with the D-pad, attack with one button and jump with the 2 button. I have to say, the developers did a great job of packing a good variety of attacks into the game. Even more impressive, they did so only with 2 buttons to work with. The controls work wonderfully and feel very intuitive. Okay, the action seems to have been slowed down some compared to the Genesis game, that is, but this works out pretty well to accommodate the Streets of Rage action nicely onto the small screen. There is a decent enough variety of enemies to lay bare knuckle to throughout the game's 6 levels. Although I have to say, things can get a little frustrating when the enemies start to juggle you, as in knocking you down, then knocking you down again the moment you stand up. This does tend to happen occasionally, and it can be frustrating to see your entire health meter drained by such a cheap tactic. But then again, this is pretty much the tactic you will use against your enemies throughout the entire game. So I suppose turnabout is fair play here. You also have a few continues to work with, and thankfully you will continue right where you left off and do not have to restart the entire level. Now, graphically, the game is one of the better looking handheld action games of the era that I have actually played. It has that classic Streets of Fire inspired art design, and the character models are drawn well. And is a review of Streets of Rage game complete without at least commenting on the music? Sure enough, the music is excellent, and as we would expect from Yuzo Koshiro. Naturally, the music here does not sound as nice as it is on the Genesis, but it certainly is a highlight of the game, and it does successfully get the vibe across. There are a few drawbacks to the game, but nothing that really gets in the way of having a good time, which is what playing games is all about. Yes, there are only 6 stages in the game, and none of which are very long, and the pace of the game is a tad slow. And I have to say, the enemies don't really pose too much of a challenge, though you could crank the difficulty up to the highest level and set your lives down to the minimum level, if that's your bag. These few quibbles, along with the instances of being juggled to death by the enemy as mentioned earlier, are fairly minor complaints when you consider all that the game does right. You would be hard pressed to find a classic portable game that gets the beat 'em up formula so right on the Game Gear. If you have played the game and it's been a while, it's a quality title that deserves a revisiting. From the graphics to the music to the near spot on controls, Streets of Rage is a classic beat 'em up. Right, now we're on to the Master System game of Streets of Rage 2, which was released in 1993. In this version, it supports single player only, and your mission is to save Adam and stop Mr. X from taking over the world. Same story. Alex, Blaze and Skate are playable. Max, unfortunately, was removed. And on top of your standard brawling, there's weapons you can pick up, including a pipe, knife and bat, just the same. Only 6 of the 8 Mega Drive levels are here, which is surprising given the original on the Sega Master System featured everything. It has some familiar areas such as the city streets and elevator stages, but does not omit locations like the baseball stadium. However, it does have unique settings, including a battle on top of a moving train, which is a nice addition. The enemy life bars are now displayed in the top right, which allows you to work out which attacks do the most damage. Gone is the awkward special move mechanic from the first Sega Master System, where you had to press a pause button on the console plus a face button, and it's been replaced by a combination on the control pad. However, for me, I have to say the combat just doesn't feel right, with ineffective punches, kicks that suffer from poor collision detection, and it takes forever to wind up a weapon for an attack. And the enemies are also much quicker than you and almost always beat you to the punch. The issue of having no grace period when you've been knocked down hasn't been fixed, and often you'll lose an entire life as you keep being attacked when trying to stand up. Many of the bosses are the same, yet weirdly some have been switched around. But in a positive note, the music is a high point and clearly resembles many of the classic tracks in the 16-bit version. Streets of Rage 2 is an absolute chore to play, and it seems as though it uses the inferior engine from the Game Gear original rather than the excellent Master System port. It is puzzling how this was messed up so badly when the groundwork had already been laid for a kick-ass sequel. So, Master System game's a little bit disappointing. Now, Streets of Rage 2 was released on various game collections and packs and so forth, so let's have a look at some of those. First up, Streets of Rage 2 was collected in the Sega Smash Pack for Sega's final home console, the Dreamcast, and this was released in 2001. There's also a port of the game as well as the first and third games on the Japanese version of Sonic Gems Collection for the PlayStation 2 and GameCube. The ports of the Sonic Gems collection are Genesis perfect, and they're the Japanese versions of the games. The game was also released on the Nintendo Wii on the Virtual Console on May 2007. And then later on, on August 29th, 2007, the game was released on Xbox Live as the Sega Vintage Collection for the Xbox 360 console, featuring filtered graphics and online cooperative playing. The game was later released on the PlayStation Network in 2011 for the PlayStation 3 also. The game also appeared on Sonic's Ultimate Genesis Collection for the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 in 2009. Then it was released on Steam on 26th of January 2011, both as a standalone purchase and part of the Sega Genesis Classics. And this also was later released for the Xbox One, PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch in 2018. I have to say, all of those collections, all of them were very good. Then it was released for the iPhone and iPod Touch in April 2011. Oh dear. There really was no hope for the classic Sega Genesis game Streets of Rage 2 in the iPhone once the decision was made to rely on the on-screen thumbstick, that covers a good portion of the screen. Actually, make that an on-screen D-pad even worse. Sadly, one of my favourite games of all time is frustrating and literally painful to play. I mean, let's get this out of the way. On the bottom left is a D-pad used to control your character. On the bottom right is a 3-button version of the Genesis control pad. Now, when I say Streets of Rage 2 hurts, I really did mean it. I mean, one stage in, my left thumb started to cramp from all the movement required and with the awkward angle. And I have to say my character was in pain too, because my thumb covered up incoming enemies and a good portion of the action. Not my favourite version of the game, I have to say. However, things did get better. 3D Streets of Rage 2 was developed by M2 as part of the 3D Classic series for the Nintendo 3DS. It was released on April 29, 2015 in Japan, and worldwide on July 23, 2015. In terms of visuals, the Nintendo 3DS pulls off 3D Streets of Rage 2 with aplomb, with brightly popping colours presented in wonderfully sharp resolution. I'd certainly go as far as say that this is the best that these particular streets ever looked. The beautiful visuals similarly look astounding with the stereoscopic 3D switch on. The depth and foreground elements have been masterfully handled. Streets of Rage 2 is one of the best implementations of 3D visuals we've ever seen yet. For video game joyriders, there's also a handy stage select that enables a jump straight into any of the 8 stages instantly. This makes it easy to take in the visual feast on offer if you're struggling to make it through to the end. As well as the implementation of 3D, M2 had once again chucked in a few additional modes. First of these is Rage Relay mode, which allows you to select all 4 characters from the beginning along with the order you want to use them in. I mean, if you lose a life, simply swap to the next character in the line. It's an interesting way to experience every character's different strategies and movesets in a single play. And for players who are finding it going too tough, there's a selectable casual mode. When this mode is active, enemies are knocked out simply by hitting them to the ground. This means you can effectively take out any bosses with a single flying kick. And if you'd like to further down the experience upon your first completion, Fists of Death mode is unlocked, making a return from 3D Streets of Rage. With this activated, a single punch is all you need to knock out an enemy. Fist of the North Star style. It's kinda hilarious, but also takes away the soul of the game a little, I have to say. Simultaneously, 2-player fun can be had over a local connection. Both players must have the game, but it's well worth the effort as the execution is flawless. Silky smooth and awesome fun. I highly recommend wholeheartedly that you try this out if you can. The single screen player versus player duo mode on the other hand is not really worth bothering with though. As for other features, it's cool being able to swap between the international and Japanese versions of the game, if only to see the title screen change to Bare Knuckle 2. There's the now standard screen option for emulating an old CRT look and feel, plus the ability to save a full replay of your playthrough. I like that. And sneaky old M2 has also infiltrated the game credits with some hilarious skits. Make sure you check him out, it's pretty funny. So in conclusion, 3D Streets of Rage 2 is class. As good as the sequel is, unfortunately the third time, for me, was not the charm. So, Streets of Rage 3 was developed and published by Sega in 1994 for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. The game includes several changes over Streets of Rage and Streets of Rage 2, such as a more complex plot, inclusion of character dialogue, longer levels, more in-depth scenarios and faster gameplay. Weapons can be integrated with unique moves with certain characters. Hidden characters were also added and a few cutscenes were included to give the story greater depth. Players can choose from returning characters Axel, Blaze and Skate, along with a new character named Dr. Zan, a robot who automatically converts every weapon picked up into a ball of energy. And by fulfilling certain conditions, 2 bonus characters, Shiva and Rue, known as Victi in Japan, can be unlocked for play, with a third unlockable character, Ash, being exclusive to the Japanese release. Several tweaks have been made to the gameplay following Streets of Rage 2. Whereas only Skate was able to run in the previous game, now each character is able to run as well as perform a vertical dodge roll. Blitz attacks can be upgraded through successive play, and the rechargeable meter allows players to perform a special attack without losing any health when full. And certain weapons now have special attacks that can be performed in the same way as blitz attacks. However, all weapons now have a limited number of uses before they break, and unlockable characters are unable to hold weapons at all. Stages in the game include hazards, originally featured in the first Streets of Rage, such as bottomless pits. Some stages have alternative routes, depending on certain actions, such as whether players can clear a room of enemies before a non-playable character is killed by poisonous gas. Enemy AI was also expanded, so more enemies can pick up weapons, block attacks, employ cooperative attacks, and even steal exposed food items to regain health. Compared to the Japanese version, the Western release of this game features altered graphics and sound effects, and increased difficulty, and does not feature Ash as a playable character. I have to say the Japanese version is far superior than the Western release. When the game was localised from the original Japanese version to the English language release, significant changes were made. The clothing of the 3 returning heroes, Axel, Blaze and Sammy, was altered from their original colours seen in previous Streets of Rage games. The female enemy characters wore less revealing outfits, and a sub-boss named Ash, a gay stereotype, was removed from the English version. And the voice effects were also changed, with the most notable Axel's catchphrase of Grand Upper for his blitz move being replaced with Bare Knuckle. Another notable difference between the 2 games is the plot. The Japanese version of the story opens with a new explosive substance called Raxine, discovered by the character named Dr. Gilbert, who is later revealed to be the true identity of Dr. Zan, and this explodes in the city and kills thousands of people. And at the same time, a military general named Ivan Petrov vanishes. And it is later discovered that Mr. X orchestrated the general's disappearance and plans to use Raxine to start a global war. And in the English version, all references to Raxine were removed. General Petrov was replaced by the city's chief of police, and the plot now involves a scheme to switch major city officials with robot clones in order to take control of the city. Another difference was, if the player failed to save the general, the player has to head to what appears to be the White House. This too was changed in the English adaptation, where instead, if the player failed to save the chief, then the player has to head to City Hall, although the building depicting the City Hall is clearly based on the White House. Now, the bad ending sequence from the Japanese releases features a photo of a devastated city, as text narrates the player's failure. This was removed in the Western releases, and text scrolls upward on a black background. The credits were removed from the bad ending of the Western version, possibly to show that it was not the true ending, whereas in the Japanese version they still play. The game's overall difficulty was also altered for the English version, with the game's normal setting being significantly more difficult than even the Japanese version's hard setting. Also, the English version of the game cannot be completed on the easy setting. It will end after stage 5. Axel and Skate are noticeably absent from the European box art, where the new character Zen appears alongside Blaze. And this is because the box art for the game was originally used as a magazine cover art that Sega of Europe bought later to be used. Another significant difference between versions is that the special attacks consume less of the player's health in the English version. So for me, I have to say I was a bigger fan of the Japanese version of Streets of Rage 3. For me, Streets of Rage 3 was when the series hit a wall. It was less of an interactive sequel and more of a colossal downgrade with its hugely increased default difficulty setting, and a soundtrack, I have to say, that was more experimental to the point of unlistenable. You are now unable to lift certain enemies and can be hurt for trying. Other new enemies could shoot you from across the screen with a handgun. And those biker enemies now had a huge life bar, rather than being taken out in one hit as previously. Some levels even had time limits and branching paths. They were not a good fit for the series, I have to say. Okay, the introduction of multiple engines was a great idea. That is until you realise the requirements to get a good one. I doubt many had the patience and skill to get an engine that didn't see the city destroyed by bombs. Even unlocking that boxing kangaroo to play couldn't save this game. It's a shame to see such a disappointing entry. And I have to say, once the Sega Saturn arrived, Sega tidied away the bulk of its franchises into a drawer and forgot about them. And it's sad to say this series was no exception. The Japanese version of Sonic Gems Collection includes Bare Knuckles 1, 2 and 3, and these are excluded from releases outside Japan to obtain the lower age ratings. And also, Streets of Rage 3 later appeared alongside its other games in Sonic's Ultimate Genesis Collection. On May the 3rd, 2012, Streets of Rage 3 was released on Valve's Steam platform, both as a standalone game as well as a part of the Sega Genesis Classics Pack 5. And the game also appeared in Sega Genesis Classics for Xbox One and the PlayStation 4. And of course, the game was also released for the Sega Vintage Collection series in 2012, and it features the original trilogy and allows the player to choose between the Japanese, European or North American versions of them. Again, I highly recommend the Japanese version. Then, in 2007, the game was released for the Wii Virtual Console. Okay, here's Streets of Rage 3 on the iPhone. It may have a boxing kangaroo, but it's also got slowdown, a steep difficulty curve and 0 new bonus features. And finally, Streets of Rage 3 is included in the North American and European models of the Genesis Mini 2 micro console released on October the 27th, 2022. Although the Japanese Bare Knuckle 3 is not featured on the Japanese Mega Drive 2 Mini. It can be played by changing the language settings though, but the section in which the players can fight against and unlock Ash have been removed from this version of the game. So, that was Streets of Rage 3. It's certainly a little different from the previous entries in the series. It's not my favourite, but perhaps I'm being a little bit unfair here. Let me know your thoughts. I mean, it's fair to say that it had easily outdone the graphics of the first two Streets of Rage games due to the larger sprites, but for me, it also failed to significantly advance the gameplay of the series. The plot is lacklustre and the music certainly takes some getting used to. If you've never played any of the Streets of Rage series before, then I highly recommend Streets of Rage 2. It's probably a better entry point, but be sure to sample this third outing at some point. Well, at least the uncut Japanese version, that is. Although it was one of the most popular Sega franchises in the 1990s, no new official Streets of Rage games were released for over 25 years after Streets of Rage 3, and that's excluding the re-releases of the first 3 games via the various Sega game compilations we've just seen. Fighting Force, the abysmal PlayStation and Nintendo 64 game, could have become that next entry. The game was originally called Judgment Force and was initially pitched as a potential 4th instalment. It was supposed to be released on November 26, 1996, but Sega made a rare correct decision and declined to take core design up on their offer. Therefore, the Judgment Force was unreleased and was redesigned into Fighting Force. Now, remnants of Judgment Force can be seen in the character designs of Hawk and Alana, who bear a striking resemblance to Axel and Blaze. If only the gameplay bore a resemblance to the quality of the previous titles, because this game, it's not very good. In the late 90s, there was also a Streets of Rage planned for the Dreamcast by Sega of Japan. As you can see, the demo showed a character similar to Axel fighting off a group of enemy characters. Various changes in gameplay had apparently been planned, including the introduction of new team attacks and a new first-person perspective. Allegedly, due to the new management of Sega of America being unaware of the series and its past success, Sega did not follow up on it, and the game never advanced past the demo stage. And then there was Backbone Entertainment. These are the guys behind Sonic Rivals and the Mega Drive Ultimate Collection, and they pitched a new Streets of Rage game to Sega, but this project also failed to proceed. A former employee of Backbone, Arvin Batusta, posted up some images on his blog, including concept designs for the main characters of the original Streets of Rage, Axel, Blaze and Adam, plus a street punk. At least we can get a taste of what it could have looked like. Numerous unofficial fan-made projects and remakes have been developed, including Beats of Rage and Streets of Rage Remake. Beats of Rage is a fan-made, homebrew tribute to Sega's Streets of Rage series. It supplants the original graphics and characters with resources taken from the King of Fighters series, albeit with tongue-in-cheek renames. Originally developed by Senile Team, the underlying engine powering Beats of Rage later went on to become the Open Beats of Rage game engine project. And in the game, the players take control of Max Bacon, Mandy Blueguard or Kula Gem to defeat the forces of Mr. Y, who's taken over an unnamed city. Beats of Rage supports 2-player cooperation and a pseudo 3D field. In-game characters always face left or right but are capable of 3-axis movement. Player characters are mechanically similar, sharing the same techniques and fighting abilities. Other than visual appearance, only slight differences in movement speed and starting hit points distinguish them. Each may execute a 4-hit combination attack, a jump attack that knocks down enemies and a second jump attack that only stuns. And by walking into an opponent without attacking or getting hit, the player character will initiate a grapple, allowing execution up to 3 hold attacks or a throw. Players are also equipped with 2 special attacks. The first has a considerably risky execution time, but knocks enemies down and boasts a longer range than most other techniques. The second special attack is an all-direction attack that is invincible while active, and usable even when grabbed or hit by consumables, a small portion of the player's hit points. Enemy characters attack the player with a variety of abilities, typically a lesser mix of the player's own array of techniques. And each stage is punctuated with a stronger boss enemy. And when the boss is defeated, a stage is completed and the next stage begins. For me, Beats of Rage is simple and a fun beat 'em up. Despite not having a good story or a lot of characters, it's still super entertaining for 1 or 2 players. It's definitely a traditional recreational action game. Now we're on to Streets of Rage Remake, also known as Bare Knuckle Remake. Now this game is a Streets of Rage fan game project which began on March the 17th, 2003, and it consisted of more than 20 developers. The lead developer, named Bomber Link, stated that the game was made from scratch without borrowing any element of reverse engineering. Streets of Rage Remake is ultimately designed as a remake of the original Mega Drive trilogy, though in some ways it can be seen as a true sequel to Streets of Rage 3. It's all based on visual interpretation, comparing how things work in the original games and trying to mimic it for Streets of Rage Remake. Animation, timing, animation positioning, control response, XYZ positions and physical movement for all characters are accurate to the original games. There's also autosave save states that allow you to continue the game from the same point. I like that. And there's also 30 configurable options in the menu. Not to mention the 6-button controller actions are there also. The game includes original cutscenes between stages, totaling over 40 cutscenes and 8 endings. Gosh, 8 endings. The designers worked for years to create new sprites, creating 19 playable characters, all with a complete set of moves, new enemies, new details on the stages, and much more. In regards to the music, it's been remixed by 5 different musicians and spanned practically all the songs in the original series, including the Game Gear versions and some new tracks, a total of 76 songs. Amazing. Streets of Rage Remake was released by Bomber Games in April 2011 as a download for Bomber Games forums for the Windows PC platform. I have to say, it was a really good game. I enjoyed playing this. However, days after the game's release, Sega took legal action against the unauthorized game in a form of cease and desist order, going after the Bomber Games forum. After Sega contacted the development team, the forum's website took down links to the game's download and asked forum members not to redistribute the game file. Sad, but I suppose I understand where Sega were coming from. After all, it was a profitable franchise and they should be making the money. So, in 2015, the crossover game Project X featured Axel Stone as a playable character, along with Mr. X-possessed Robo Axel as a boss character. This marked the first new appearance of Streets of Rage characters in over 20 years. And then, there was a new entry in the series since the Genesis. Streets of Rage 4 was announced in 2018 and released in 2020, taking place 10 years after the events of Streets of Rage 3. The game was developed by Lizard Cube, Guard Crush Games and Dotima, who previously released the 2017 remake of Wonder Boy 3 The Dragon's Trap. This game is a continuation of Sega's Streets of Rage trilogy, and Streets of Rage 4 received generally positive reviews and sold over 2.5 million copies by April 2021. And there was also an expansion, Mr. X Nightmare, which was released in July 2021. Carrying on the style of gameplay from previous entries in the Streets of Rage series from the early 90s, Streets of Rage 4 is a side-scrolling beat-em-up in which up to 4 players locally or 2 players online fight against waves of enemies, aided by disposable weapons and item pickups. Alongside standard attacks, throws and blitz moves, each player character has a set of special attacks that can be performed at the cost of some health. In this game, however, players can restore health spent on a special attack by performing successive follow-up attacks without getting hit. Each character also has a unique super combo, also known as star moves, which can be performed by collecting stars in each level. There's also a new combo system which was introduced, along with the ability to juggle opponents against walls and other players, allowing players to earn extra points by stringing together long combos without getting hit. Each of the characters have very unique traits, such as max wall jump and grappling jump, Shiva's weapon parry mechanics, an aerial rave air combo, and Floyd's long range grapple. The main gameplay mode, Story Mode, sees players going through each level as the story is told, with a stage select unlocked after clearing Story Mode. Set 10 years after the events of Streets of Rage 3, the story features playable characters fighting to free Wood Oak City from the control of the Y-Tins, the children of previous series antagonist Mr. X. Players have a limited number of lives depending on the difficulty setting, but can earn more by earning a certain number of points. And if all players lose all their lives, they will have to retry the level from the beginning, with the option to use assists that add extra lives and star moves at the cost of a reduced score. Upon clearing a level, players receive a rank based on how many points they scored. Points earned goes towards a lifetime score, which goes towards unlocking bonus player characters from past games, presented in pseudo 16-bit style. The game also features arcade mode, which tasks players with clearing the entire game with limited lives, a boss rush mode, and a competitive battle mode, which lets two players fight against each other. And the game also features a retro audio option, featuring music tracks from the Mega Drive, Genesis and Master System Game Gear versions of the first two games. The base game features 5 main playable characters: series veterans Axel Stone and Blaze Field and Adam Hunter, who originally appeared in the first Streets of Rage game and is unlocked through playing the story, and new characters Cherry Hunter, Adam's daughter, and Floyd Area, a part cybernetic apprentice of Dr. Zan. And as I already said, 16-bit versions of characters from the original trilogy, including Max Thunder, Skate, Dr. Zan and Shiva, can be unlocked by raising their lifetime score. These characters feature movesets based on the games they came from. Example, Streets of Rage 3 Axel can run, unlike Streets of Rage 1 and Streets of Rage 2 versions of the same character. The Mr. X Nightmare DLC adds 3 additional characters who appear as bosses in the main story: Max Thunder and Shiva, who were originally playable in Streets of Rage 2 and Streets of Rage 3 respectively, and brand new character Estelle Aguirre. And the Streets of Rage 3 version of Rue can also be unlocked through a cheat code. Anyway, let's have a look at the game. Now, it doesn't end there. There was a spin-off minigame based on the Yakuza Like a Dragon series. Streets of Kamurocho was released as part of Sega's 60th anniversary celebration. The game was developed by Empty Clip Studios and was only available for Windows via Steam. Streets of Kamurocho is a crossover beat-em-up with Streets of Rage gameplay with the Yakuza characters. There's only one stage, a reskin of Streets of Rage 2's first stage, with bosses from the first Yakuza. After it's cleared, it loops and starts over again. Both playable characters Kiruru and Yujima play like Axel in Streets of Rage 2. Ichiban from Yakuza Like a Dragon can also be unlocked as the third character, but he also plays the same as the other two. And then, Sega announced a new Streets of Rage game at the Games Awards in 2023 with a management meeting presentation revealing its name as Streets of Rage Revolution.
Did you save the game?
Really? Of course I did.
Let me reintroduce you.
Now, Streets of Rage Revolution isn't named Streets of Rage 5, which implies it could be more of a spin-off than a sequel. Or it could simply make more sense for the series to evolve into something new, as the name Revolution implies. Either way, we expect we'll be beating up legions of Syndicate goons once again. And then, finally, a feature film and television series based on the series was announced in 2016. Lionsgate landed the motion picture rights to the Sega game and has enlisted Derek Kolstad. He's no stranger to the world of Broken Bones and Crush Ribs from his stint writing John Wick and its sequels. The exact plot of the film is unknown at this time, but if it follows the original games, then it's in good hands with Kolstad and Lionsgate. I mean, can you imagine a Streets of Rage game, but a bit like John Wick? Wow, that'd be brilliant. So, there you go. Now, ask any Sega gamer about Streets of Rage, and you'll probably see nostalgic smiles with tales of late night co-op gaming with their childhood friends. Lots of kids in the 90s, including myself, lived for these types of games. Beat 'em up games were a huge genre, and Streets of Rage was certainly the top of the pack. I think even today, if people had to rank the best beat 'em ups of all time, Streets of Rage will be somewhere on the top of this list. Its dynamic soundtrack with club beats bumping like a heartbeat through stereo blew the minds of many young gamers. I hope you enjoyed my video covering the Streets of Rage series. Hopefully, this is a series that should return a lot sooner this time, and should have no need for a retrospective in the future. Streets of Rage is back and better than ever, and I don't see Sega putting this one back in the drawer. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this lengthy video. I hope it was okay, and I certainly took a lot of time to prepare and pull this together. I hope it was worth it. Please also share your thoughts on these games. Let me know if you agree or disagree with my thoughts. Perhaps I was a little bit too harsh with that Streets of Rage 3. However, that is the thing with giving your views on video games. It is my opinion, and it is totally okay for you to disagree. It is purely my opinion based on my thoughts and my experience of playing these games. But please, share your thoughts. Oh, and please remember to press that like button, share, and even better, subscribe to my channel. Again everybody, thanks for watching, very much appreciated. Until my next video, take care, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye bye.